I built that bridge myself, plank by plank, in the dead of one summer that bled into fall. Back when the only noise out here was the whisper of pine needles in the wind and the soft call of loons on the lake at dawn before the HOA even had a name. Before Karen moved into that oversized stucco monstrosity and declared herself queen of lakeside policy, back when neighbors waved instead of filed complaints, and back when I believed that hard work and clean K, boundaries meant something. And so that bridge, the one that stretched just 20 feet across a narrow inlet from the main road to my cabin, the cabin my grandfather helped me frame when I was just a kid swinging a hammer too big for my hands, that bridge wasn't just lumber. It was legacy. It was connection. It was a statement that this land was lived in, loved, respected, and mine. And for over a decade it stood unchallenged, undisturbed, until the HOA began creeping further and further beyond their limits, enforcing new rules that never went through public votes, issuing citations for grass being 1 inch too high, harassing retirees over mailbox shapes, and fining one poor young mother for hanging wind chimes that didn't match the community aesthetic, and I mostly ignored them because my land, cabin, and bridge were outside the HOA's jurisdiction. A fact clearly stated on the original land plat and reinforced by the county records that I kept laminated and locked in a safe. But Karen, oh Karen, she didn't believe in boundaries, not physical, not legal, not moral. And when she took over as president, she made it her personal mission to clean up the lake perimeter, which really meant driving out anyone who didn't conform to her fantasy of lakeside uniformity. So she started sending letters. At first, passive-aggressive suggestions that I update my bridge to match the HOA's newly approved materials list, which was hilarious because my bridge predates the HOA by 7 years. But when I didn't respond, she escalated, filing false complaints with the county, calling my bridge a safety hazard, claiming it was structurally unsound, even though it passed every inspection I paid for and had weight-tested supports rated for vehicles heavier than her Range Rover full of HOA gossip. And I figured if I ignored her long enough, she'd eventually run out of steam or find another target. That I was wrong, dead wrong, because one Monday morning, while I was out on the far end of the lake checking the spillway car gate, I heard a sound that didn't belong. The grind of metal against rock, the high roar of diesel engines, and by the time I got back, my heart already pounding with dread, I saw what they had done. My bridge was gone, demolished, flattened, torn into pieces and left in piles like old firewood, and standing near the smoking remains was Karen in her scarpa. Oversized sunglasses, cutboard tucked under one arm like a weapon, smiling as she told the
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Cutboard tucked under one arm like a weapon, smiling as she told the demolition crew to hurry it up before he gets back. And when I stormed down the path, rage boiling in my chest, she had the audacity to wave at me and say, "Good news. The hazard's been removed," like she had done me a favor, and when I demanded answers, she told me the HOA had voted without me, of course, and that I had 7 days to remove debris or face a sanitation. Fine, and the deputies she'd brought stood there like props, unmoved even when I showed them the land deed. Even when I pointed out the boundaries, even when I told them what had been destroyed was private property outside HOA control, because Karen had called it a civil matter, and that was enough for them to back off, telling me to handle it through the courts. But I wasn't about to wait 6 months for a judge to give me what was already mine. I was going to make this right, not through the system she tried to manipulate, but through strategy. And the very next day, I started making moves. Quiet ones. Surgical ones. Because while she thought I was licking my wounds, I was laying foundations, and the first thing I did was contact my old friend Marcus at Key, drone surveyor and GIS specialist, who flew over the entire area and produced a high-resolution map of the demolished bridge, complete with GPS-tagged key, coordinates that clearly placed the destruction on my private land, and while that was happening, I dove into the county records again. This time not for defense, but for offense. And what I found changed everything. Because the single road that leads in and out of the HOA's gated entrance was built decades ago on a thin easement granted by a now defunct timber company. And while the HOA had paved it, maintained it, and assumed it belonged to the county, the truth was murkier. The actual ownership had lapsed due to unpaid taxes, and the land had quietly reverted to the county land bank, where properties go to rot, and more importantly, where they go up for public auction. And I didn't hesitate. I contacted a real estate lawyer I trusted, established a holding trust under a name that would never be traced to me, and placed the first bid on the 5-acre strip of land that held the only road in and out of their community. And while I waited for the sale to finalize, I played the part of the defeated neighbor hauling in supplies by boat, refusing to rebuild the bridge, waving to Karen's board members as they smirked from their docks, letting them believe I was cut off and stuck, while in reality, I was building a second access road from the east. A hidden gravel trail that looped through my cousin's farm, giving me full entry and exit without touching the HOA's road ever again. And when the deed came through official and ironclad, I wasted no time, hiring a contractor to install a 12-foot steel gate across the road with reinforced fencing stretching into the woods on either side, motion sensors, and solar-powered locks. And when it was done, I added one more touch. A massive sign that read, "Private road easement, revoked no entry without permission." And then I waited, knowing full well what was coming, and I didn't have to wait long, because within hours, the phone calls started. Residents confused, deliveries halted, emergency services calling dispatch for reroutes, and of course, Karen said, screeching into her phone demanding I take that gate down immediately, to which I simply replied, "What gate?" and hung up, because the moment she bulldozed my bridge, she gave me every reason to return the favor, tenfold. And when the sheriff showed up again, it was with a very different tone, because now I had paperwork, now I had proof, and when I handed him the fresh deed, tax clearance, and parcel plat showing the road was now mine, he looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, he's within his rights," and the color drained from her face like someone had pulled the plug on her whole empire, because she realized then that I hadn't just blocked a road, I had severed her control. And as the board panicked, residents began to whisper, and the local news caught wind.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Residents began to whisper, and the local news caught wind of a gated community trapped by private road drama. I sat on my cabin porch with a cold beer, watching the sun set over the water, thinking about the bridge they destroyed, and how in trying to isolate me, they had isolated themselves. Because I wasn't rebuilding, I wasn't forgiving, and I wasn't stopping not until every inch of control they ever thought they had was stripped from them, just like they stripped that bridge from me. And this was just the beginning. But what really pushed me beyond the tipping point wasn't just the bridge, or even Karen's smug face as she watched her hired crew reduce a decade of carpentry into matchsticks. It was the bubbly silence of the other residents. The ones I used to nod at during dock cleanups, the ones who'd borrowed tools from me, waved from their kayaks, shared 4th of July fireworks over the lake, and now watched from their porches like cowards as Karen's dictatorship tightened its grip on everyone in her path. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about me. It was about every neighbor who had been steamrolled, fined, shamed, or pushed off their own land for not playing HOA dress-up with their cabins and mailboxes. And so my war became bigger than just revenge. It became a mission to expose them all, and I started digging, not just through land records and public easements, but through the HOA's own public filings, minutes from board meetings, tax forms, grant applications for community improvement funds, and what I found was worse than I expected. Misused funds earmarked for infrastructure upgrades spent on Karen's pet landscaping projects. Zero bid contracts awarded to her cousin's shell company for gravel replacement, and backroom rule changes pushed through without proper votes or quorums. And I started keeping a file, thick and detailed, digital dossier with timestamps, screenshots, PDF, and names, lots of names, and I reached out quietly to neighbours I trusted, people who'd been targeted like me there was Ed, a retired Navy vet whose small dock had been dismantled one winter for protruding beyond regulation limits, and Lisa, who ran a bird-watching group and was fined $300 for installing a solar panel the board hadn't formally approved. And together we met in secret at my cabin, ferrying across by boat, our phones in PAL. Airplane mode. Building a case not just for public exposure, but for total collapse of the HOA. And while Karen and her cronies laughed about their lakefront cleanup victory, I was laying the tracks for their full downfall. Step by step, starting with public land record audits I had sent to a friendly county clerk, triggering an administrative review of the HOA's zoning permits, followed by a quiet interview I gave to a local tundran. Investigative journalist named Samra, who had covered HOA abuse stories in the past and was hungry for a new exposé. And as she started poking around, showing up at board meetings with a recorder in her jacket, a camera crew parked down the hill, Karen began to feel pressure, real pressure, not from me, but from systems she didn't control. And she started sending out defensive emails, full of passive-aggressive legalese about misinformation and external agitators. But it was too late. The narrative was shifting, and residents were talking, some quietly, some angrily, because I wasn't the only one blocked by that bridge. Turns out a dozen homeowners used that route for utility access and emergency backups, and now they were vulnerable. And when one elderly couple had an ambulance delayed by 20 minutes because of debris from the demolition, their daughter nearly sued the HOA on the spot, and I included that incident in the file I sent to the State Code Enforcement Office, along with drone footage of the still uncommitted bulldozer entry path the HOA cut through wetlands without approval, and that triggered another inspection, this one from the Department of Environmental Protection, who don't like hearing about marshland being compacted without soil impact studies. And now Karen was juggling fire-legal pole. Threats, environmental audits, residents growing hostile, and a newspaper sniffing around her past. And to make it worse for her, I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was buying up more land, slowly and strategically, creating an invisible box around their community with every tax-delinquent lot and forgotten roadside strip ISM could grab. And I even managed to acquire the small gravel turnaround at the lake's southern edge that their clubhouse staff used to unload equipment. And when I fenced it off and posted a sign that read, "Private property no launching surveillance active," it shut down their entire kayak program for the summer, and the complaints started flying not at me, but at Karen. Because the residents were finally asking what she'd done, what she'd provoked, why the bridge incident had triggered a chain reaction of locked gates, blocked roads, and now multiple investigations, and her answers weren't good. Enough anymore. And when she tried to organize a closed-door board meeting to vote on new HOA emergency powers, Samra from the paper recorded the whole thing and ran a front-page article titled, "Bridge War Sparks Backlash. HOA Overreach or Landowner Revolt." And that was the beginning of the end, because now people beyond the lake were watching. County commissioners started receiving angry emails from both sides, and the sheriff's office Dashimsao quietly sent me a message. "We're not getting involved unless someone breaks a law. Stay within your rights." Which meant only one thing: I was winning, and I wasn't even halfway done. It started with whispers, rumors swirling through the HOA board like smoke before the fire hit. Questions Karen couldn't silence anymore. Residents demanding to know why their Amazon packages weren't getting delivered, why emergency crews were getting delayed, why the landscapers stopped showing up because the road they all relied on was suddenly private and locked tight, and though Karen kept insisting it was all temporary, but the issue would be resolved soon. Behind her polished smile and staged emails, panic was setting in like rot in a wooden beam. And it only got worse when the county land use office confirmed publicly that the HOA no longer held legal right-of-way across the road they'd paved 30 years ago, but a private citizen may now own the PAR. Land, had revoked access legally, and had every right to gate it off with surveillance and no trespassing warnings, and that's when the residents started turning on her for real, some quietly removing their HOA yard signs, others confronting her on Saka, evening walks, and some even calling me directly to ask if they could negotiate independent easement deals just to get groceries and go to work. But I didn't respond, not yet, because this next phase wasn't about negotiation, it was about accountability. And while Karen scrambled to hold emergency board sessions to try and pass legal retaliation measures, I'd already dropped the hammer where it hurt most. I'd filed an official civil suit for property destruction, citing my
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
I'd filed an official civil suit for property destruction, citing my drone footage, boundary surveys, and the environmental violations her crew had triggered by bulldozing into protected shoreline zones. And the lawsuit wasn't small. It demanded 6 figures in damages, and named Karen personally, along with the HOA board, and the moment she received the subpoena, witnesses said she turned pale, like she'd just watched her empire crack in half. Because HOA funds couldn't protect her now, this was personal liability, and while her lawyer cousin tried to wrangle a delay, the judge fast-tracked the case due to evidence of retaliatory destruction of private infrastructure, which made the local paper again headline, Lake HOA President Faces Destruction Lawsuit Amid Access Dispute. And suddenly the story wasn't about some landowner feud. It was about corruption, abuse of power, and the implosion of a tyrannical HOA, and Karen's reputation, once untouchable, fell apart like the bridge she'd bash. Ordered, demolished, especially after Samra's follow-up article revealed that the HOA had never filed proper permits for the bridge removal and had used discretionary community maintenance funds without a vote, which meant she didn't just overstep, she may have committed fraud, and the HOA board started breaking apart, 2 members resigning within 48 hours. One giving a quote to the press saying they had no idea the action was illegal, while Karen fumbled through PR statements and tried to spin it as miscommunication, but it was too late because I wasn't the only one crass. Filing Lisa, Ed, and 6 other homeowners filed a joint motion to force a forensic audit of the HOA's financials, which revealed thousands of dollars in improper expenses, including Karen using HOA funds to rent the bana, machinery that destroyed my bridge. And when that audit went public, the rest of the neighborhood exploded. Homeowners held a private meeting, one Karen wasn't invited to, and voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA permanently. But since their own bylaws required a board vote to execute the motion, and Karen refused to schedule it, I made my final move. I offered to sell the community back their only access road, but with conditions: ironclad and public condition 1, Karen resigns; condition 2, the HOA permanently dissolves; and condition 3, the road becomes a public right-of-way funded by community tax, but managed independently from HOA rule. And it was that deal or stay trapped, because I'd already put plans in place to file a formal petition to rezone the road as a private reserve corridor, which would cut off permanent access unless they agreed, and the residents, now fully fed up, took a vote overwhelming majority in favor, and the next day, under pressure, Karen gave a teary resignation speech on the sidewalk outside the clubhouse, but no one clapped, no one comforted her, because her tears were tabula now. For her own fall, not for what she'd done, and by week's end, the HOA charter was nullified, the clubhouse shut down, the fines and liens voided, and the land they once controlled was now a quiet community without rulers, just neighbors, finally free. And as for Karen, her story didn't end with resignation. It ended in court, where the judge ruled in my favor, awarding me full compensation plus damages, a public apology, and an injunction against her from ever contacting me, or stepping foot near my land again. And the final scene of it all came 6 months later, when I stood on the new bridge I'd finally built, not to reconnect with their road, but to span the inlet in the opposite direction, linking me to an even more remote section of land I'd purchased quietly while the chaos raged, where I'd begun building a second cabin, a retreat fully removed from HOA memory, and as I walked across that bridge, at sunset, boots echoing against the polished cedar planks, I glanced back at the old gated road, now rusting behind a for sale sign posted by the bank, and thought about how they took my access and tried to trap me, only to be trapped themselves. And how sometimes the best fences don't just make good neighbors, they make bad neighbors disappear forever.